The siege of Jerusalem was a massive military endeavor the likes of which had not been seen since the fall of Carthage 2 centuries earlier. Starting in April of 70 AD and lasting nearly 5 months, the battle would be a brutal, no-holds-barred brawl fought over every inch of the city. At stake was the success of the Great Revolt in Judea and the survival of the Jewish people. Roman involvement in Judea first began in 63 BC when Pompey the Great was drawn into a Jewish civil war, and eventually seized Jerusalem. However, the region saw much turbulence during the final years of the Republic and was taken over by the Parthians, before legions returned to install the puppet King Herod. Eventually, a series of Procurators oversaw Judea, but these largely lacked the competency or military power to impose order. Roman authority was highly dependent on local elites who themselves often lacked the confidence or respect of the Jewish people. On top of this, the population of Judea was divided across lines of class, ethnic, and religious divisions. As a result, the region was highly unstable. Revolutions seemed perpetually around the corner. In May of 66 AD, rioting amongst the people was met by the heavy-handed overreaction of the Roman Procurator Florus, who only further incensed the situation by plundering southwest Jerusalem and killing 3,600 people. As the situation escalated, reinforcements soon arrived from Caesarea, only to be driven out by a rebellion that now spread to the entire region. Jerusalem was taken by Jewish rebels, while Roman strongholds were eliminated in Judea and Perea. Roman efforts to combat the uprising were led by Vespasian and his son Titus, under orders from the Emperor Nero. The campaign season of 67 AD saw Vespasian advance south from Antioch and focus his efforts on subduing Galilee. Field battles were virtually unheard of, given the huge advantage the Romans held, and most of the fighting was concentrated around fortifications. This resulted in particularly brutal treatment of any populations which did not submit immediately. Rome often acted particularly strict to make a point. During the 68 AD offensive in Judea, for instance, cities downstream of the Roman army learned of their approach not by messaging, but by the arrival of bodies floating down the Jordan River. The campaign ground to a halt with the news of Nero's death. The anarchy that followed was known as the Year of 4 Emperors, and included a bid for power by Vespasian on July 1st, 69 AD. By the summer of 70 AD, he had come out the victor and set sail for Rome to claim his prize. Titus was left in command of the Judean campaign with instructions to put an end to the Jewish uprising. This, of course, meant the long-delayed assault on Jerusalem, home to the rebel leaders and the heart of the resistance. Titus began the Jerusalem campaign in the spring of 70 AD. His army of 4 legions was assembled in Alexandria and marched north to Caesarea along the shoreline. Supporting his force were 23 cohorts of auxiliary infantry, 8 alai of cavalry, and numerous detachments of local troops provided by the region's client rulers. Historical records seem to claim that this force numbered around 60,000 men. These estimates imply that the core legionary troops made up around 35% of the army, the auxiliary troops about 32%, and the remaining local forces about 33%. Such a high proportion of local troops does raise some doubts on the accuracy of our sources. However, we may speculate that local rulers were eager to donate men to the war effort in a political bid to secure Rome's goodwill amidst a bloody revolt. The Roman commanders themselves may also have been eager to have additional troops at their side. While the local forces were surely not as reliable as the crack legionaries, they could take on many responsibilities of the army, and thus free up the elite troops to do what they did best. This would be especially important in the upcoming siege of a city as large and well fortified as Jerusalem. The Roman forces approached Jerusalem in separate marching columns due to the security and supply constraints of the Judean hill country. Titus led both the 12th and 15th legions by the most direct road, while the 5th Macedonica approached via Emmaus, and the 10th Fretensis approached via Jericho. On April 23rd, the lead units of the 12th and 15th legions arrived on the hills to the north of the city. That night, the 5th Macedonica arrived, and by morning, the rest of the army entered the battlefield. Before them lay the great city with gleaming temples and stout battlements. The city of Jerusalem is surrounded on 3 sides by steep ravines. To the east lies the Kidron Valley, to the west the Gihon Valley, and sweeping around the south is the Hinnom Valley. A series of hills surround the area, including the famed Mount of Olives to the east. Ancient Jerusalem itself was built atop several key topographic features. The city incorporated two spurs of land with the Tyropaean Valley in between. Atop the eastern spur stood the Temple Mount and the Antonia fortress. The heights of the western spur were occupied by the elites who had built the upper city during the Hashmonean and Herodian periods. In the middle of these two areas was the more ancient and crowded lower city, which held most of the population. Both the upper and lower cities were enclosed by a wall, which was anchored on the flank by the massive fortifications around the Temple Mount. Inevitably, the population outgrew its bounds, and the second city was developed north of the first wall. This exposed position was soon surrounded by a second wall, which ran from the Antonia in the east to the Genoth Gate in the west. By the 1st century AD, yet another suburb had sprung up to the north, known as the New City. Once again, expansion necessitated fortifications, and in 41 AD, Herod Agrippa commissioned the construction of a third wall. This was an ambitious project with massive stone blocks meant to enclose a large area. It seems the scale of the defensive works raised some suspicion amongst the Romans who forced their client king to abandon the project before its completion. Over the course of the Jewish Revolt, however, the people of Jerusalem managed to put the finishing touches on their third layer of battlements. By the time the legions arrived outside Jerusalem, the walls had been raised an additional 9 meters and a series of square towers were built projecting outwards. The combination of tough terrain and stout walls made for a formidable 3-layered defensive network. Additionally, the maze of narrow streets between the fortifications could be easily blockaded, while numerous underground water and sewage passages meant that defenders could emerge from any direction for a surprise attack on intruders. Bunkered within this massive, fortified city was a garrison of approximately 20,000 Jewish troops. However, these were not professional forces. Rather, they were a motley assortment of militiamen, refugees, and zealots. This composition is a reflection of the thoroughly fractured nature of the Jewish resistance. Since the outbreak of the revolt, an effective, centralized government had failed to take form, and the resistance suffered from a chronic failure to synergize its various factions. Jerusalem had been divided along party lines and was tearing itself apart in bloody political infighting right up until the arrival of Roman forces. The principal leaders were Simon Giores, who laid claim to the upper city, and John of Gischala, who was based out of the Temple Mount. Simon led the larger of the two forces, which included 10,000 men under 50 officers and 6,000 allied Idumeans under 8 commanders. These troops garrisoned the first wall from the Kidron all the way to the Palace of the Kings. On the other side of the city, John had an armed following of around 6,000 men under 20 officers and was joined by Eleazar with his 2,400 zealots. These forces held the Temple Mount, along with the surrounding neighborhoods including the Ophel and the Tyropaean Valley. Traditional Jewish fighters were lightly armed and armored. They fought at range with slings, bows, and javelins, before closing in with spears, swords, and clubs. While agile and determined, they often stood no chance in a straight-up engagement against Roman forces, especially heavy cavalry. However, the Jews in Jerusalem were much better prepared than was typical. They had been amassing equipment from Jewish workshops, Herodian armories, arms dealers, deserters, and defeated enemies. A substantial amount of gear had been gathered from the defeated Romans at Beth Horon, including an array of artillery pieces. In addition, the confused mess of siege warfare would negate many of the advantages a Roman force would enjoy in a field battle. Lastly, it must be said that the morale of the defenders was strengthened by the inevitable survival instinct that took hold when a city resolved to fight or die. While considering the armies as important, it would do well to remember that sieges are battles of attrition. As such, it is necessary to ask about the food and water supplies. Fresh water, at least, was not of immediate concern, owing to the presence of numerous cisterns around the city, as well as several massive pools which trapped rainwater. Food, on the other hand, was in short supply. During the infighting that preceded the siege, Many of the grain stores had been raided or destroyed by opposing parties. In addition, the already huge population of Jerusalem had swelled to dangerous levels in recent weeks with the arrival of pilgrims celebrating Passover. The non-combatant populace far outnumbered the armed defenders and imposed severe limitations on the length supplies could last. Once the Romans closed in on Jerusalem, the countdown began. The Roman army had undergone a long march to reach Jerusalem. Titus recognized that his men were exhausted and ordered that they construct preliminary camps out of range of the city. The 12th and 15th legions, who had arrived from the northeast, began to set up a kilometer away, atop Mount Scopus, with another camp planned for the 5th Macedonica, 550 meters further back. As the legions moved into place, Titus rode ahead to personally survey the defenses. On the morning of April 23rd, he set off with 600 horsemen, following the road that led to the main gate of the third wall. However, the terrain was uneven and cluttered with gardens, olive groves, hedges, fences, walls, and stone structures which had been knocked down by the defenders. In other words, he walked into a maze of obstacles. All of a sudden, Jewish forces burst out of the gate and swarmed the Roman column, cutting it in half. Cavalrymen in the rear bolted out into the open country they had come from. Meanwhile, Titus and his escorts were left behind. The general had neglected to wear his helmet or breastplate for the expedition, but nonetheless drew his sword and led a charge to break out. According to Josephus, he, quote, diverted those perpetually with his sword that came on his side, overturned many of those that directly met him, and made his horse ride over those that were overthrown, end quote. The encounter was a close call, but ultimately the Romans were able to cut their way through, though they lost several men and left many injured. Titus was likely shaken by the event and eager to get the siege underway. He ordered the 10th Fretensis to move even closer and began constructing entrenchments atop the Mount of Olives. However, the Jews were emboldened by their new success and decided to follow up with a massive assault. Sorties poured out of the eastern and southern gateways, their sights set on the working legionaries. Fighters streamed across the Kidron Valley and descended upon the half-built camp of the 10th Fretensis. The Romans were caught completely off guard. Jewish troops started cutting down their disorganized opponents, while more reinforcements rushed out from the city to complete the rout. Titus attacked the flank with his bodyguard, which was enough to force the mob back down the ravine. The 10th Fretensis resumed work, only to come under a second assault from Jews who had been steadily bringing in more and more men. This ferocious attack overwhelmed the Roman force on the low ground. Many of the soldiers fled for the heights, while Titus and a band of troops attempted to hold the line. Soon after, the legionaries regrouped and countercharged down the hill, driving the Jews back once more. In the ensuing lull, the camp fortifications were finally completed. This secured the Roman forward position, but left everyone with a reminder that the strength of the Jewish defense had been dangerously underestimated. In response, Titus now took precautions against further counterattacks. He posted cavalry divisions to deflect attacks and ordered that the ground between the Roman camps and the walls be cleared of all obstructions. This meant cutting down trees, flattening hedges, filling in ditches, and destroying rock projections. This had the dual purpose of removing any cover for Jewish sorties, as well as preparing the ground
News
for
from
siege
Rome,
works.
Nero is dead.
The Roman
campaign
army
halts.
had effectively rolled up its sleeves. It was time to get to work.
Break through! Carthage!
Titus recognized the hardship of attacking from the east, where the ravines were steepest. As a result, he decided to focus on the western flank of the third wall. The 10th Fretensis was left to hold the Mount of Olives, while the 3 remaining legions were redeployed. The 5th Macedonica built a camp 400 meters west of the western gate, while the 12th and 15th
Roman wall
legions
tightens
established
stone.
themselves opposite the Cephinus
Carthage
Tower.
crosses anew. The siege of
Artillery
ambition.
positions were now deployed with their
harvest of
sights
sorrow.
set on the city.
Legions
Under
advance!
their covering
The city
fire,
will be ours.
each legion began constructing an earth and timber ramp
Brothers
up
to
to
the
the
walls!
third wall.
We will not yield!
Jewish projectiles rained down from above, and attack parties slowed construction at all times of night and day. However, the concentrated might of the three legions with artillery support proved too much. The attackers completed their ramps, and soon were slowly
Tear it
rolling
down!
battering
We
rams
will
into
build our
place.
own fortress here!
The thudding of the rams signaled progress for the Romans, but also served as a rallying cry for the defenders. Militia units from around the city swarmed into place to pelt the crews and their guards with missiles
down
from
the
above,
entire
while
northern
raiding
stretch!
parties attacked the
Melt back
engines on
off the
foot
wall!
from postern doors.
Fire everything! Harass their works!
The Roman legions march relentlessly toward Jerusalem, their dust heralding the empire's unyielding advance.
Brave defenders fought their way up to the ram's protective sheds and were poised to destroy the equipment before Titus led a cavalry attack to drive them off. Before ramming was resumed, Roman engineers built 3 siege towers, which were too heavy to be overturned and which were also fireproof. These were then rolled into place to provide close fire support for construction
wall!
and
Every
clear the
stone!
area of defenders. On the
Unity or
15th
death!
day of the siege, the rams broke through the third wall. The Jews yielded the outer city to the Romans and withdrew to the second wall. Titus was eager to keep the momentum rolling and established a camp in the heart of the new city, tearing down many structures in the process. The rams were now brought into position once again and targeted the central tower
Higher!
gate.
The wall must rise to meet the threats ahead.
Within 4 days, a breach was formed.
Let this stand for generations.
The flames of Carthage flicker in our
The legionaries
reflections,
formed
reminding
up
us
in
that
advance of
empires
the narrow
rise and
gap.
fall in an endless
However,
cycle.
they were met
Standing
with
over these
eerie
ruins, we feel the
silence.
weight of history, the melancholy of Scipio's
As
tears.
the troops advanced cautiously through the seemingly deserted streets, they were all of a sudden attacked from all directions.
Vespasian, Titus, take the
The
legions.
trap was now
By
sprung,
your command,
and Jews
Imperator, we
began
march.
unleashing
The Galilee
barrages
will
of
fall.
missiles into the dense infantry clusters. At the same time, hit-and-run parties attacked any exposed troops who had strayed too far from the main body. In shock, the Romans attempted to retreat back through the breach but found that it was so narrow that only a few
Dig
men
deeper!
could get through at a
The
time.
entrenchments must be ready before
This
dusk.
choke point was a prime target for the bowmen
Good work,
and
men.
slingers of the
fifth
defenders.
is here. The siege
Roman
begins.
archer units were brought up to provide
Forward!
covering fire
To the gates!
and eased up enough pressure to allow for a withdrawal. At the same time, however, the Jewish force was mobilized to surge ahead as the Roman tide receded. They rushed back onto the walls, unloading continual barrages onto the attackers. Meanwhile, sorties with large blocks of Jews
Legions
pressed the
advance,
Romans
or Nero
back
to south.
while the breach was mended.
Keep pace. We march to Caesarea.
Josephus recalls that the fighting raged all
There
day
lies
long
Jerusalem.
and into the
Prepare
night.
the assault.
Action around the tower gate continued,
Your zealots
and by
weaken
the
us,
4th
John!
day,
Your caution
the
is
legions
betrayal,
once again
Simon.
broke through.
We endure
This time, Titus ordered that the entire northern
Hold
stretch
fast,
of the second
drive them
wall
back!
be torn down and the surrounding towers be manned by Roman forces. The Jews now pulled back to the first wall. This was part of a deliberate plan to carry out a fighting retreat against the Romans, conserving Jewish strength while maximizing their damage. The commanders were finally
Forward!
in a
To
position
the
to make a
gate!
stand now that the defensive line had a much smaller surface area than at the start of the siege. This meant that the outnumbered Jews could far more
We hold
readily
the wall!
concentrate
No
forces
retreat
and
for the
rebuff
temple!
attacks.
Drive them back!
At this point, Overall command of the defense had been
Resistance
granted
hold
to
at
Simon, who
Starvation
held the
loomed.
first wall along the northern side up to the royal palace.
Drive the rams
John's
forward! Clear the
Galileans
ground!
and Zealots held the Temple Mount and the Antonia fortress on the eastern edge of the line. The legions advanced into the second city.
Drag.
Titus dispatched the 10th and 15th legions to raise ramps to the west, where the second and first walls met. To the east, he had the 5th and 12th legions start construction against the Antonia fortress. They did so under incessant sorties and missile attacks. Historians tell us that the Jewish forces at this point would have been able to bring to bear
Through competitive
300
labor,
bolt
the
throwers
Romans complete
and
their
40
wall.
stone throwers from the rebel armory.
Starvation drives the
This
desperate to
firepower
boil
was
hay,
considerable
as
and
rebels
must
are
have forced
crucified
the Romans
along
to
the
build
wall.
their own protective countermeasures. On the 29th of
Press
May,
the attack!
after 17
Breach the
days
wall!
of intense labor and non-stop harassment, the Romans completed their attack paths up to the eastern and western flanks. Battering rams, siege towers, and numerous cohorts were brought up for an all-out assault. However, unbeknownst to the Romans, the Jewish forces had been hard at work themselves. They had secretly conducted sapping operations with a tunnel traveling under the first wall right up to the siege ramps against the Antonia. The excavations were supported by pit props, which the Jews set alight. As the fire took its course, the ground gave way and a huge chasm opened up, engulfing the ramps and their siege engines. Fires, which were
Legionaries
temporarily
assemble.
smothered,
We march
erupted
on.
once more as the bitumen reignited and burned what remained of the equipment. The Romans had once again fatally underestimated the defenders and were reaping the consequences. To the west, Simon sallied out at night to attack the siege works
Brothers!
in his sector
The
of the
enemy surrounds us,
battlefield.
but we will not yield! Hold the line! Let their legions break upon
The
our
brave
walls!
rebels beat back resistance and fought their way to the rams, setting their sheds alight. The fires alarmed the legionaries, who saw their hard work going up in smoke and rushed in to try and pull the rams out of harm's way. They were met by Jewish reinforcements streaming out from postern gates, and a pitched battle ensued. A deadly tug-of-war followed over the rams, with the rebels finally managing
For
to complete their
Jerusalem, ban their
destruction.
engines!
The demoralized Romans pulled back. Sensing an opportunity, the Jewish forces swarmed out of the city in pursuit, driving the legions all the way back to their camp. The retreat was stabilized when once again, Titus rode to the rescue with his cavalry. Fierce fighting ensued, but the rebels were finally pushed back to the first wall.
Rear guard
The
ball!
Roman siege lines were in
Move
shambles.
out!
Virtually all of their rams and ramps were smoldering ruin by morning, and the morale of the legions must have been in a similar state. It was approaching the hottest part of the year now. Water was running low, and building material was becoming increasingly hard to come by. Nonetheless, Titus launched an ambitious plan to restore the spirit and security of the men. His plan called for the construction of an 8-kilometer wall of circumvallation with 13 forts.
The ancient
To
world
do this,
fractures,
he leveraged
symbols
the
of
proud
history
nature of the
consumed
troops
by
having the
flames.
legions and
Pompey the
cohorts
Great
challenge
seizes
one another
Jerusalem,
for the honor
his
of being
legions
the first to
clashing with
complete their
defiant
allotted portion
defenders.
of the wall. Relatively safe from Jewish attacks, the legionaries were free to reforge their unit cohesion through competitive labor. The result was
Hold
a
on line!
stunning
Restrain
success.
yourself!
Within
Take
3
longbow!
days, the entire structure was completed. Morale amongst the
To the
Romans
eastern
was
gate!
restored,
Prepare
while the
the
Jews
sacrifices!
were left with a stunning sign that the Roman war machine wasn't backing down. If anything, things had just shifted into high gear.
With the completion of the wall of circumvallation, the noose
The
around
legions are ready,
Jerusalem was
Titus.
finally pulled
Jerusalem will fall. We
Previously,
march at dawn.
citizens had been able to slip out at night to collect supplies from the countryside, but now this proved impossible. Any rebels caught outside the walls were crucified as a terrifying example of Rome's wrath, while even those who defected willingly were often gutted by troops who believed their stomachs would be filled with precious items ingested for concealment. Inside, the food situation
Onward!
rapidly
To the
deteriorated.
third wall!
The defenders were reduced to eating pets and boiling hay.
Hold possession!
Disturbing
Charge
reports
through!
also mentioned instances of infantile cannibalism taking place.
Now in the 10th week of the siege,
Legion, advance!
Titus ordered all forces
city
to concentrate
awaits!
their assault on the Antonia fortress. The full-scale assault began with the mobilization of archers and artillery to
Ambush!
suppress the
Come in!
walls, while 2 battering rams moved
Lie
into
down!
position and men armed with crowbars took aim at the foundation
Charge!
blocks of the towers. Despite great efforts made the first day, the Romans were forced to withdraw for the night without making any noticeable gains. Unbeknownst to both sides, however, the heavy activity in the area took a toll on the structural stability of the fortress. The
Galilee
mine,
falls.
which had
The
previously
legions
brought
are
down the
efficient.
Roman siege ramps,
Judea will
had
follow,
also
Father.
undermined the
In the
Antonia.
chaos of 69
A
AD,
heavy rain,
Vespasian
combined
was
with the
declared
pressure of the
emperor.
men and the
Jerusalem
machinery
will
at
fall.
work, provided the straw that broke the camel's back. In the dead of night, the northern wall of the fortress collapsed. At first light, the Romans positioned themselves for a direct assault through the breach. Once again, however, the Jews were one step ahead and had already constructed another secondary wall on the other side. Unwilling to give up the nighttime gift, Titus asked for volunteers to tackle the fortifications head-on. A handful of brave men volunteered, no doubt encouraged by the
Pompey's
promise of
legions
rich
and
reward.
sieges, Disposed grim
This gang took heavy fire as they ran up to the
culminating in the
barricade,
march
but
on
managed to
Jerusalem.
scramble over the top.
The year of
The
4
attackers
emperors
proved too
passes.
few, and with no reinforcements on the way, were inevitably slaughtered. The failure of this mission in full sight of the Roman army sapped their will to fight. A
Press
tentative
forward!
stalemate ensued. 2 days later, in the early morning, 24 enterprising Romans, including a standard bearer from the 5th Macedonica and a trumpeter, decided to attack on their own initiative. The men silently climbed the ruins of the Antonia fortress and slit the throats of the sentries. With the barricade now secured, the trumpeter sounded a signal. This blast within the walls threw the Jews into a panic as they jolted awake from their sleep. Imagining that the entire Roman army was upon them, they
Crush
fled
this
to the Temple
insolence!
Mount.
Let none defy
Meanwhile, the
Rome!
Roman command was equally confused, but knew something had to be done. Titus, along with his officers, collected picked men from the units and immediately sent them towards the sound of the trumpet. When the Jews realized that the Romans were not hot on their heels, cooler heads prevailed and they rallied. Militias streamed into the courtyard as it soon became apparent that the real Roman forces would now certainly be on their way. If they gained a foothold in the sanctuary, all was
Forward!
lost.
Into the grove!
Both sides realized that this was the case and plunged into the darkness towards the passages linking the Antonia to the Temple Mount. Brutal fighting occurred in the close-quarter confines that dragged on for nearly 10 hours. In the end, the fury of the Jews, fed by constant reinforcements, prevailed over the Romans, who sounded the retreat, thus ending the first battle of the Temple. Titus ordered the men to raise the Antonia on his side of the battle lines, and within a week was ready to renew the attack.
Pull harder!
7,200 legionaries, picked from 30 of the best troops from each century, were mustered at night on July 17th. These men silently shuffled towards the ruins of the Antonia for a surprise attack. Jewish sentries, however, picked up on the advance and sounded the alarm. In some areas, Roman forces were able to cut their way past the previous week's high water mark. However, in the obscurity of the night, chaos reigned. This was made even worse by the fact that the rebels had equipped themselves with captured Roman gear to the point that many legionaries and Jewish units ended up bumping into and fighting friendly forces. The combat was so confused that it proved virtually impossible to capitalize on any gains either side made. When the sun eventually began to rise, some degree of order was finally restored. Josephus reports that both sides now separated and drew up into ragged battle lines at the edges of the sanctuary's northern edge. Missiles began to fly, and a savage pitched battle developed. Titus attempted to orchestrate an organized attack, but the tight confines again rendered this futile.
The camp is weak! Strike now! No quarter!
By midday, it became apparent that no gains would be made, and the second battle of the temple was called
The
off.
eastern attack is too difficult with these steep ravines.
Clearly, it would be
focus
impossible
on the
to
western
punch a
flank.
hole through the Jewish bottleneck. Titus thus resolved to broaden the scale of the attack. In the peak of the summer heat, he ordered 4 more ramps to be built against the northwestern corner of the Temple Mount. In response, the Jews massed their missiles at the walls and sent forth
Hold the
continuous
line!
waves of
For
skirmishers
Jerusalem,
and sorties to harass the work crews. Nonetheless, the legion steadily made progress.
Drive
With the
them
works nearing
back!
completion, the defenders tore down the northwestern corner of the temple colonnade, severing connection between the defensive parapets and the remaining elements of the Antonia. This effectively removed a key avenue the Romans were hoping to use as an attack route. At the same time, a major sally was attempted against the Roman wall of Circumvallation at the Mount of Olives. Though unsuccessful, this assault once again attested to the boldness of the defenders. A cornered beast was certainly a force to be reckoned with. On the 27th of July,
Go forth and
Roman
secure
work
the
parties
Empire's
building
destiny.
a ramp against the broken end of the
Onward to
western
Jerusalem!
colonnade spotted an opportunity. It appeared
river
that
runs
Jewish
red
activity
with
on
their
the other fronts had
defiance.
caused a withdrawal
Higher.
of defensive forces in the
Raise
area.
this wall before
The
the
legions
enemy
rushed
arrives.
forward with ladders for an immediate assault by escalating. Hundreds of troops now swarmed onto the undefended walls, with
See how
many
we
more
turn
following
engines
behind them.
against them!
However, the Jewish retreat
Whoa,
had been a
whoa,
trap.
reverse them!
In the previous days, they had secretly filled the rafters with dry
No
wood
surrender!
and bitumen, which they now set alight. The entire sector of the wall burst into flames, with the Roman assault troops caught in the inferno. This occurred in sight of both armies and provided a tremendous morale boost to the defenders. The Romans proved wary of another escalate assault and instead tried to breach the walls with rams and picks. For days, they worked around the clock in relays to undermine the defensive fortifications. They did so under a continuous bombardment of missiles and harassment. Eventually, several huge blocks were pried loose, but the thick construction of the Temple Mount defied all attempts at destruction. Titus must have been unimaginably frustrated. Desperate for results, he ordered another storming of the walls. The results were predictably bloody. Roman troops climbing the ladders were dangerously exposed. Many found themselves toppled in their attempts to scale the walls, while others finally managed to reach the top under continual artillery and archer covering fire, only to be left isolated.
Hold the line!
Those
We
that
must
did
repel
make it
their
up
advance.
were vastly outnumbered
Zealots,
and
fire
slaughtered.
with the
Roman centurions resorted to throwing legionary eagles onto the walls in a bid to motivate the
The
proud
Roman
soldiers to retrieve
Circumvallation
them.
Wall,
However,
8 kilometers
even this
long,
desperate
completed in
measure
3
proved
days.
fruitless
The
and
Noose
only resulted
tightens.
in the death of even more bull-headed
Inside,
attackers.
the food crisis
The
worsens.
increasingly costly assault was abandoned. Rather than abandon all hope, Titus made preparations for yet another attack on the
city
temple
will
in
fall.
the beginning of
Press the
August.
siege.
The objective
63
would be to
BC,
finally push through the
Pompey
bottleneck at the
seizes
Antonia
Jerusalem,
and move
installing
out
the
onto the
Procurators.
open spaces of the courtyard
Cassius Florus
where the legions
plunders
would gain
Jerusalem,
the necessary
massacres
space to fight
Procurators.
effectively. Archers and artillery were massed in and around the ruins of the Antonia. These began to target the defenders holding out at the north end of the temple complex.
The upper city is mine.
Once they had
Stand
cleared,
divided.
Roman
Tell
troops
Blood Race
burnt
your
out
voice.
and tore down the entire northern colonnade. This would allow the attackers to deploy along the entire width of the plaza, while at the same time stripping away a crucial Jewish defensive position. While the northern battlements were now destroyed,
legion advance
sight
towards
lines
the
were
Mount of
opened up
Olives.
onto the other flanking battlement positions. The defenders stationed here found themselves dangerously exposed and were forced to pull back. The Jewish line of defense was reformed and now cut across the center
The
of the
East
Temple
Ravines are
Mount,
too
with the
difficult.
temple itself
Focus our efforts on
serving
the
as a
western
central
flank.
bastion. It is around this time that the gravest of ill omens
ramps are
took
complete.
place. This
Advance the
spiritual
towers.
crisis involved
On
the daily
15th day, Ram
sacrifice
breached the
of
third
lamb
wall.
to Yahweh.
Yield the outer
Like
city, withdraw to
clockwork,
the second.
The priests had upheld the holy rite of Tamid amidst the
Tear down
bloodshed
the
and
northern
starvation
wall.
of the siege.
Man the towers.
But on the 5th of August, the last of the sacrificial lambs ran out. Now, at the height of the siege, with the Romans advancing, the Jews lost their connection to God.
Legionaries, advance! Breach the third wall! Ambush! Fall back to
The
the
stage
breach!
was now set for a fight over the very heart of
Archers,
Jerusalem,
cover the withdrawal!
the Temple
Tear
Mount.
down the northern
The
wall!
left end of the
Pull
ragged
back to the
Jewish
first
line
wall.
was stationed at the
Command is
western
mine.
gate, with access to the upper city.
Strike
The right flank was anchored on the opposite side of the colonnade at Solomon's portico. The center of the line ran through the temple and its inner court. The Romans held the north, the Jews held south. Both sides were prepared for a fateful duel within the enormous
Titus
gladiatorial
launches his
arena
ambitious plan.
that was the Temple
Legions
Mount complex.
compete to build the wall.
In the
3
center of
days,
the
wall is
battlefield
complete.
was the linchpin of the Jewish
Inside,
defenses, the
charming
inner
ship's
temple.
example.
Just like the Temple Mount, the
Concentrate
temple was
all
surrounded
assault
by a
on the
wall with
fortress!
wide fighting platforms atop a series of perimeter colonnades.
Fires!
The eastern half of the
the
compound
breach!
was known as the Court of Women. This was then connected to the western half by another wall and the Corinthian Gate. On the other side lay the Court of the Israelites, and beyond that, the Court of the Priests. At the very end lay the Holy of Holies, a 45-meter tall, white marble edifice adorned with enormous golden gates and
Build
topped
the
by
ramps.
golden points.
We will breach the
This
walls.
was said to be the very house of God, in which only the high priest entered on the Day of Atonement. In fact, the entire inner temple was normally off-limits to all but a select few. Extraordinary circumstances, however, call for extraordinary measures, and the holy spaces today were packed with defenders. Despite being exhausted and on the verge of starvation, the Jews attacked at dawn on August 9th. Troops burst out of the eastern gate and rushed the Roman lines in force. The surprised legions reeled from the punch, but managed to hold their ground. Once more, Titus had his cavalry mount up and charge across the open ground. The small group of horses crashed into the Jewish mob, sending shockwaves through the mass of men. However, the attack failed to dissuade the rebels, and the third battle of the temple began. This engagement was characterized by a confused series of attacks and counterattacks along the eastern end of the sanctuary. Jewish defenders offered supporting fire from atop the nearby temple rooftops, while their Roman counterparts did the same from their own rear lines. The fighting raged on for several hours before subsiding into an uneasy stalemate. The following day, August 10th, the Jews again launched an attack on the Romans holding the outer court, initiating the fourth battle of the temple.
Hold the
engagement
line,
was
we will not
similarly
break!
hard-fought, but the crush of a Roman counterattack managed to drive the defenders right up to the temple walls itself. Here, Jews atop the walls dislodged stones and threw down an assortment of projectiles onto the Romans. However, in the close press below, a pair of legionaries were seized by impulse. One grabbed a piece of flaming
Observe
debris,
the
while
smoldering
the other
ruins. Let
hoisted
them
him
fuel
up
your
against
resolve.
the north side of the temple. From this elevation, he lobbed the burning timber through a low
wall is our
golden
victory.
door
The city
into
will fall.
the sanctuary chambers. In the summer heat, the highly flammable timbers and textiles took light. Thick, black smoke billowed into the air as fire spread rapidly to the stunned amazement of both sides. The fire rapidly spiraled out of control, threatening to consume the countless sacred texts and treasures within the temple. The Jews were left paralyzed between choosing to fight the flames or the Romans. The legions seized on the initiative and plunged forward without orders. They battered down the eastern gates and penetrated the inner court of the temple. In this moment, at the climax of a grueling 3-month siege, the attackers gave way to their bestial nature.
In 70 AD,
Soldiers
the Roman
broke free
Empire
from their
laid siege
officers,
to Jerusalem,
controlled only by a
city of
toxic
immense
psychological
scale,
state
defended
of
by
repressed
Herodian
rage and
walls a
frustration.
gleaming temple.
Pity was the first casualty, soon followed by a butchery of all those who did not flee the hellscape. The young, the old, the helpless. All were put to the sword. This bloodlust would
Nero
only
is
be
dead.
matched
The
in
Empire
intensity
fractures.
by greed.
Opportunity
Roman
rises.
soldiers
March
plunged
to
into the
Judea!
flaming complex, intent on making
The
off with
legions stand
treasures
ready.
inside.
Jerusalem
The
will
frenzy
fall.
reached a fever pitch, where Roman troops were being trampled to death by their comrades.
The walls are
The
strong, but
arrival
our
of
unity
Titus
is
seemed to
fragile.
have little effect on the state of the men.
Passover pilgrims strain
This
and
was often a
storm
natural
mercy.
occurrence in the final stages of a siege, when even the ablest of commanders could do nothing to restrain the wild passions of soldiers. Eventually, the delirium subsided when the temple was picked clean by both men and flames. Chants of Imperator, Imperator, Imperator greeted Titus as he ordered the sacrifice of an ox, a sheep, and a pig at the eastern gate of the temple. With this move, he consummated the domination of the Roman gods over that of the Jews. Though the Temple Mount had fallen, Jewish resistance in the rest of Jerusalem had not. Simon's militia and those who had escaped the smoldering ruins of the temple regrouped atop the entrenched positions in the upper city and Herod's palace. From here, they faced off against the legions across the Tirpane Valley. A parley was held atop a bridge linking the two sides. The Jewish commanders,
10 for 10
Simon
is
and John,
closer.
attempted
Fortify
to
them out of
bargain for their
olives.
free passage out of Jerusalem. Titus, however, was emboldened by his recent victory and demanded no less than an unconditional surrender. When talks broke down, the legions were unleashed on the lower city in a demonstration of force. For 2 days, they hacked their way through tight alleys and rooftops, cutting down rebels and non-combatants alike. Fires were also set to clear out any survivors from the lower districts. The flames did tremendous damage to life and property.
They also engulfed vast quantities of dead bodies in various stages of decay, filling the air with a horrid stench. All that remained now was the last stronghold of Herod's palace. This fortress was dominated by strong walls and a ring of towers ranging from 25 to 40 meters tall. In addition, the buildings of the upper city blocked a clear line of approach, while numerous underground passages could allow the Jews to carry out effective sorties against incoming seaports. The Romans had faced significant trouble against similar defenses already, and were not eager to try it once more.
The legions of Rome advanced
Instead, the
on
attackers
Jerusalem,
opted to mount their assault
their banners
from the west,
unfurled.
flanking from outside
The walls of the
Jerusalem.
holy city stand defiant
All four
under the shadow
legions
of
now
war.
massed in the Hinnom Valley
Legionaries,
and began construction of a final
Lord
set
for
of siege
Rome and
rams.
glory.
Allied and auxiliary troops within Jerusalem also set to work on their own platforms against the upper city, located at the Viaduct, the Gymnasium, and Simon's Tower. Resources and manpower for the Romans were extremely sparse. This delayed construction to a degree, but the projects were inevitably completed by the end of 2.5 weeks. On September 7th, the Romans were able to bring up the remaining rams and begin battering down the walls. The Jewish forces at this point were so weakened that for the first time, they did not need sorties out against the siege equipment. Defenders attempted to offer resistance from the top of the walls, but were easily
Legions
swept
and
aside by
Sidon
mass fire of Roman projectiles. Sections of the western wall began to crumble.
Timber to the front!
Legionaries
Secure the
punched
flanks!
their way through the breaches against a defensive force that was quickly disintegrating. It seems that the reality of a final defeat swept in with the Roman troops and captured the battlements more quickly than any sword could. The high towers of the Hippicus, the Phasael, and the Miriam were all abandoned as survivors either gave in to the inevitable or went to ground. The Jewish leaders, along with groups of dedicated fighters, ran in all directions, desperately seeking to find a way through the Roman lines. Many were caught by Roman street patrols, while others resorted to crawling through sewers
Closer to the
or
Mount
even
of Olives.
attempted to tunnel their way out of the city. In
Charge!
the end,
Break
both
their line!
Simon and John were captured alive. They, along with 700 other young men, would be sent to Rome to be put on full display for the eventual triumph of Titus. All remaining males of the age of 17 and above were shackled and sentenced to death, either in the mines of Egypt or in the gladiatorial arenas around the empire. The women and children were taken to the slave markets. All told, we have no accurate figures for how many lives were extinguished or enslaved as a result of the sacking of Jerusalem. Josephus would have us believe that over 1.1 million were killed, while Tacitus offers a more plausible 600,000. These numbers both seem wildly inflated, but may be an indication of
Hold
the
firm,
carnage
brothers,
that
the
took
enemy
place when
falters.
Titus resolved on destroying
For the
a highly
temple!
populated
Loose
city
after!
filled with refugees and pilgrims.
They will not pass
We have
these
only to
walls.
look at the modern sieges like Stalingrad to imagine the horrors which befell the numerous non-combatants trapped within the walls. Back in Rome, Emperor Vespasian was busy preparing the stage for the honorable return of his son. The victory at Jerusalem warranted a triumph and would be used as a centerpiece for the legitimization of the Flavian dynasty. When the time came,
Tear down
Titus would
doors!
parade
Block
down the
them from
streets
right!
of Rome atop a chariot at the head of a procession glorifying the conquests in the east. Soldiers and captives marched down the streets in full regalia alongside floats depicting dramatic scenes from the campaign. Vast amounts of treasure were also on display, including the great seven-branched menorah. The crowning moment of the festivities involved the flaying and ritual strangulation of Simon Gioras, who had served as the overall commander of the Jewish forces during the siege. While
Hold
the
the
revolt
line!
may have been
Push
symbolically
forward!
crushed, Jewish resistance would burn on until the final Roman suppression of Masada in 73 AD. Though this would bring about the conclusion of the first Jewish revolt, there would be several more to follow, each with increasing levels of devastation. The Siege of Jerusalem stands out as one of the most brutal examples of classical era total war since the fall of Carthage 200 years earlier. Humans did this. Hundreds of thousands of babies, cradled by mothers, grew up through millions of unique experiences only to find themselves, all at Jerusalem. Each of their stories worthy of its own novel, unraveled one way or another over these 3 months and have, through the great filter of history, been reduced to a reference in this very sentence. I don't think you or I, or our species, has the capacity to truly understand this. In the end, perhaps all we can do is take the time to pause and and reflect.
Soldier something, y'all.
As we do this,
now.
we can,
For
in a way,
freedom, man!
commune with our ancestors who did the same. At Carthage, for instance, it is said that Scipio Aemilianus weepingly looked over the flames which engulfed the city, imagining that one day
Children
such
are
flames would
starving.
be seen over
We
Rome
have
itself.
nothing left.
At Jerusalem, we can imagine that Titus was also seized by similar thoughts. Today, I am sure, we can also bow our heads humbly and reflect upon the destruction we reap across the world, which may one day